Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online Adolescence Psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in work, leisure, and media. Very exciting. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So let's begin by giving a historical perspective on adolescents' free time. Before 1900, adolescents typically worked full-time and had comparable schedules as adults. This changed as child labor laws became more popular, were federalized across the United States. Common jobs for high schoolers did not exist then, such as retail and fast food. The abundance of free time in the lives of today's teenagers had several origins: a moral panic and compulsory schooling. As adolescents gained more autonomy, they became consumers with plenty of discretionary income. Post-World War II affluence, the idea of the teenager emerges, and marketing targeting teenagers also emerges. So we've talked about numerous times throughout this class the impact of industrialization and how that changed how adults work, but also it impacted children with kind of schooling became eventually through time required, and then the presence of child workers declined through time. One big reason why it became glaringly evident that some of the jobs that children were now working in the 1900s was bad was because basically the new jobs that popped up. Industrialization brought kind of a new requirements for jobs that placed a lot of children at risk. There was numerous incidents of children dying in fires, just lack of work safety, and kind of new industrialized kind of assembly line, those kind of jobs that children were losing their hands, arms, whatever. And it was not just children, but adults as well. So the jobs that were working at the time isn't like retail and stuff. Like there was no like Walmart then, in 1900. There's not like most fast food places did not exist. Really, the concept of fast food really did not exist then. So kind of more of the jobs that were worked on were highly dangerous, not just for children and adolescents, but for adults as well. But kind of the onset was kind of a social, maybe a backlash, but kind of reaction to that lack or new introduction of child labor laws, aka now children have more free time because they're not grinding in an industrial plant, they're not in the coal mines. Now it's like, oh man, we have a moral panic. What do we do with these kids? They're gonna have so much free time, and then they're gonna go do the crimes. So one kind of response to that was to make organizations like the Boy Scouts. So we got to introduce young boys to kind of proper etiquette and kind of tasks and stuff like that, so they can develop into a theoretically pro-social adult. Granted, I would suggest looking up the Boy Scouts. Controversy surrounded the Boy Scouts, wherein something about 8,000 of its leaders were accused of sexual crimes. So, maybe the moral panic directed in the wrong direction, or maybe both directions, who knows. Compulsory schooling, we already kind of talked about this. And then kind of the idea here is that as adolescents have more autonomy, so again, they have more free time now. But at the same time, we have that World War II bump of U.S. wealth. We've already talked about this, a moment in history that creates kind of boomer massive amount of wealth that frankly probably will never be repeated. But that wealth is going to trickle down to the adults, children. So now these teenagers have disposable income, right? So now a whole marketing campaign emerges because corporations recognize, oh, these children now, or adolescents, these what will eventually be called teenagers, have money to spend. So let's create ads that target teenagers so they can buy stuff. So, you got to buy these new clothes to be the coolest teenagers. So kind of that kind of idea of the cool teenagers really emerges kind of out of this material basis of again, kind of for historical reasons. Over the last 50 years, there's been a significant decline in the proportion of time devoted to paid jobs and a significant increase in time devoted to leisure among adolescents. Over the last decade, teenagers spend less time at part-time jobs and socializing. There are differences, however, in male and girl activities. Studies suggest that adolescents' free time is not a zero-sum phenomenon, in which involvement in one activity displaces involvement in another, but as one of three main types. Well-rounded adolescents with substantial time commitments across many different activities, A mixed extracurricular portfolio predictive of better development than only sports. Unclear if well adjustment is the result of extracurriculars or if well-adjusted youth are more likely to participate in extracurricular activities. So we have a historical trend here of the amount of free time that exists, which you already talked about, but even more recently, in the last 50 years, we see kind of less time at part-time jobs and more time, and I should also say less time socializing with each other. So it's not like, woo, they have less time, so now they're going to socialize with each other. Instead, adolescents are more likely to spend more time sleeping and doing homework. And there are differences, though, in kind of activity, kind of rooted in traditional gender roles, wherein boys more likely to spend time playing sports and girls spending more likely to spend more time kind of doing shopping or household errands. And this could kind of be rooted in, obviously, traditional kind of like gender norms or roles, and also kind of like maybe girls maybe spending more time with their mothers, who again, kind of even more so having more traditional gender roles through time on average. But there are kind of shifts in this trend. And kind of research suggests overall that for free time, really kind of a well-rounded approach to adolescent leisure time is most associated with like kind of well-being of an adolescent. So not just kind of like playing sports, or not just having kind of like, or whatever, just being in the nerd club, whatever nerd club you want to be a part of, but some kind of a combination of different things wherein you're getting kind of different experiences, interacting with different groups of people, and kind of trying to like develop into a well-rounded person. But there is kind of some directionality of questions. So basically the idea here is that, and that's that final bullet point, the question is, okay, is it that extracurricular activities increase adjustment in adolescence, or is it that well-adjusted teens, adolescents are more likely to participate in extracurricular activities? So it's kind of like, oh, what is driving this effect? And it's probably some kind of combination of both. We know that at-risk teens are less likely to participate in extracurricular activities, and also kind of like being around like other people and doing fun things, play, learning, those kind of things are useful for development. So it's probably some kind of combination of both. But with the people, with adolescents who are already kind of less well-adjusted, or more kind of like, you know, a general at risk, going through more adversity, kind of less likely to join those extracurricular activities, and then kind of thus get like less of that opportunity to catch up in their kind of development. Now let's talk about student workers. The total proportion of student workers and the total amount of employed hours has decreased in students the past 2 decades. 75% students worked during high school in 1977. Today, it's about 40%. Before 1925, most teenagers, except for the affluent, entered the workforce full-time by 15 years of age. Adolescents were either students or workers, not both. As secondary education became more widespread, more young people remained in school and fewer dropped out to work. By 1940, only about 3% of high school students worked during the school year. So we see kind of like fluctuations of student or adolescent, teenager, you know, depending on what era you're in, work. So kind of looking at our first kind of section here, you can see in 1977, adolescents being much more likely to work. And this could be rooted in a whole host of different things. One could be the amount of schoolwork, again, that's required now. Educational requirements through time have increased. So everybody understands the classic phenomenon of like, oh, this entry-level job requires a master's and 2 years of experience. So it's like, oh, I need to like have way more time spent on like homework in order to even like make have an even a chance to have like some kind of sustainable living. But not just that. So going to that like 1925 point, wherein most teenagers are working full time. Well, one reason for that is because there are basically way less social safety net programs, social welfare programs. For example, stuff like Social Security wasn't created until over a decade later. So it's like, okay, dude, you need to get to work like right now because you're screwed. Like, there's no Social Security. You're not gonna have Medicaid. You're not gonna have Medicare. These things like literally don't exist. So it's like you're on your own. So guess what? You got to get to work ASAP and try and make a living. There's no like food stamps, no free lunch at school. Those things aren't happening yet. So it's like, so those kind of conditions are going to impact the work habits of teenagers, because you literally need to like survive and, you know, contribute to the household in some way. We also see a growth of retail and service sectors of the US economy, and teenagers were called upon to fill these positions. Teenagers worked for relatively low wages in short work shifts. So at the time, now we're starting, oh wait, fast food now exists in more across the country in bigger numbers. More change exists. More retail jobs. You're seeing a shift in the type of economy, and we're basically, what you're seeing now is now we're moving away from like a manufacturing kind of like an industrial kind of economic base to like this post industrial kind of service oriented kind of jobs. And this is kind of like the early stages of this, not the earliest, but kind of an early stage of this. Who's going to work those jobs? Well, teenagers can kind of fill those jobs, but at the same time, we are seeing kind of a decline in that massive, disproportionate amount of like wealth that the U.S. has compared to the rest of the world. So thus, kind of like household incomes are kind of a little more not as like super high as it was 20 years ago for that generation. So now it's like, okay, well, now we need kind of more income in the household. And at the same time that's going on, as the 1970s part-time jobs increase among U.S. American high school students are increasing, spoiler, at the same time, we also have a massive recession. So kind of contributing. So now kind of contributing to the increased likelihood that, okay, we now need teenagers to work in these jobs to kind of increase household incomes. So again, these big historical trends like matter in kind of developmental outcomes and the benefits and the negative consequences of working and going to school and all these kind of things. Then we move up to about 40 years ago, so whatever, now we're like in 1980 somewhere. We have kind of different standards of high schools. We kind of already talked about this a little bit, but kind of the idea now is like students begin to take higher classes. Again, it's much more harder to get into college. There's more people, more education, and frankly, a stagnation in wages. And kind of, again, that world wealth, that disproportionate world wealth that the U.S. Saw, is now super declining. At the same time, you're seeing the increase right around, if you look at any chart, around 1970s, 1980s of two-person households wherein both the mother and the father, or whatever, they don't have to have children, and they can whatever be a homosexual couple, but whatever, both adults in the house have to have a job, because their wages are now beginning to stagnate. There's less overall wealth, and now thus, okay, we both now have to work. So kind of one reason, you know, there are other reasons obviously, but we also, one reason why kind of women entering the workforce is like, hey, we don't have enough money in this household. We need two sources of income. And not only that, but at the same time now, those kind of jobs that are more secure are kind of declining. There's a greater applicant pool, larger population, and more people that are college educated, but again, more economic precarity, and we're going to basically see economic stagnation on a wage level for like the next 40, like all the way till today, frankly. Thus, things are more competitive. So now all of a sudden, oh, I have to take AP classes. I have to have all these extracurricular activities. And thus you see that free time kind of moving away from leisure activities, or sorry, I should say working, and allocating that time to just stacking your resume, stacking up your college application essay. A recession in the early 2000s resulted in unemployed adults being hired over teenagers. About 1/4 of the jobs are retail, the largest private sector job market in the U.S. Wages are not kept up with the cost of items, spend more time online, decline in getting a license, and going on dates. So again, we now have another shift. We now hit that 2000s recession, and frankly, then we hit multiple basically. And at that time, now we have a bunch of unemployed adults, and those unemployed adults are going to replace the teenagers, the adolescents at retail jobs. And not just that, and as I said before, now we've entered Now we're 30 years later. Now retail jobs are the largest job sector in the United States, which are going to pay less. Again, more economic precarity. And at the same time, as stated, the wages have not kept up with the cost of items. We're 20, 30 years into this process, and thus people are spending more time at home, online, and frankly, more alone. Because now, I don't have the money to go out. So what's the point of getting a license at all? And we saw a decline in dating among teenagers at this time. And guess what? This historical trend can continue to this day. So and at the same time, we're getting better and better internet. Not quite as smartphones yet, but we're getting faster internet. And now, boom, we can stay at home. Who cares? Now we can stay home and just post all day. We can just scroll on our phones, but on our computers at that time. At the same time, we also have immigrants bringing many willing and able adults to the United States, and the growth of new technology expanded potential leisure activities. Over the past 30 years, an increase in proportion of adolescents who report having time for leisure is important, and a decline in proportion wanting to work even if they had money. So as I stated, during these 2000s, we have internet is now coming more widespread, and at the same time, wages declining or stagnating. And we see shifts in kind of adolescents' behavior and attitudes towards work, with adolescents reporting, hey, I would like more free time, and even if I have to sacrifice a little money, I'd rather have my free time than working. So that kind of finding, think about it, if you don't know this background history, you're just like, oh, that's how adolescents always are. But again, we are all products of our historical era of these larger structures. That's not saying we don't have individual kind of differences, but still, we are all within structure, within these larger structures that impact us developmentally. And today, the majority of teenagers are employed in the retail and service industry. Unsurprising. Older adolescents are more likely to hold formal jobs, such as retail and restaurant-related jobs, while younger adolescents work informal jobs, so like babysitting, yard work, kind of word-of-mouth kind of stuff like that. 80% of 8th graders work as babysitters or lawn care of the 8th graders at work. Usually repetitive, monotonous, intellectually unchallenging jobs. However, some are stressful and dangerous. Not necessarily tedious for teenagers. Maybe school is even more tedious, so this is a relatively more fulfilling part of their time. A small proportion of jobs give opportunity to learn new and / higher level skills. So kind of traditional or whatever, kind of a common understanding retail, customer service related jobs. This can be repetitive, really intellectually unchallenging, but also can be quite stressful. As someone who's worked in multiple kinds of those jobs, whew, Panera did me some harm in the day, folks. But interestingly, teenagers don't always report these jobs as tedious as that they actually are. And one reason could be is that if you think about kind of our conversation on schools and how you kind of see a decline in creativity and kind of interest in schooling and more of a rigid approach to schooling through time, maybe, hell, your job is tedious, but hey, at least here you're maybe treated more like an adult, or you have a little more responsibility, which can be more fulfilling in some ways than education, which also speaks of kind of issues with education. So not just these jobs, but also education. And again, one issue with these jobs is that even if they don't, teenagers don't always report this as a tedious, unchallenging job, really it's kind of the teenagers on these jobs aren't learning specific new higher level challenging skills. It's kind of very, 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 very basic work in general that aren't theoretically directly translatable to hopefully careers that are related to whatever their college degree, for example. Researchers have investigated 3 broad questions about employment in adolescence: whether working helps adolescents develop a sense of responsibility, whether working interferes with other activities such as school, and whether working promotes the development of undesirable behaviors such as drug and alcohol use. Beginning with the development of responsibility, little research supports the popular view that holding a job makes adolescents more responsible. Some studies indicate high levels of misconduct on the job. Most at risk are adolescents who work under relatively less supervision. Adolescent recollections are more positive regarding learned skills than research supports. Or I said I should say people's recollections. So kind of breaking this idea here, we all have like the classic thing like, oh, you gotta work and then you're gonna learn responsibility, that kind of stuff. Little research actually like supports this, that working at like Chipotle is going to make you more likely to be like this optimal, pro-social, responsible adult. And in fact, some studies suggest the opposite, because if you think about it here, now you're working at a job with just surrounded by other adolescents, and traditionally kind of like unsupervised. You got your one manager, but they're like not up, they're not like monitoring every single second that you're doing. I mean, depending on the job, do you work at Amazon? But, traditionally like Chipotle, like whatever, Panera, whatever, Burger King, stuff like that, you're kind of just screwing around a lot. And then, sometimes whatever, we'll go outside, one, maybe you're adult workers or like smoking a cigarette. I'm like, yeah, let me get one. So it's like, so kind of like that, environment, the job environment where there's less supervision can also counterintuitively contribute to more higher rates of like drug use and misconduct in general. And people and historically, and this is kind of a common thing, people will report in recollection their or will like kind of rate their previous work experience in more positive ways than what they rated it at the time when they were working it, and more positively than research suggests. So kind of like this almost like positivity bias or something, where we imagine the things that we did as being more positive than what they are. And, this can be due to a whole host of reasons, a whole lot of speculation here, but classic, like everything happens for a reason, or it was worth it in the end. So kind of like this need to like justify that something you did was like the greatest thing or like useful in some way, or more positive than it actually was. Theoretically, they can learn money management, yet most adolescents spend all that money on things such as cars and clothes. Psychological development impacts depends on the job. Jobs which grants adolescents responsibility, a chance to make relatively important decisions, and perform challenging tasks are more likely to be associated with development. Repetitive, stressful, unchallenging jobs are far more likely to show, or I should say far less likely to show positive developmental outcomes, and this is consistent with adult development as well. Possible but highly improbable. Retail jobs are ranked as the highest stress and least likely to provide skills development. So kind of we have some variation. It kind of depends also kind of on the job that you have. So wherein you have a little more responsibility, you can make decisions, things are a little more challenging, so you can kind of work on your problem-solving skills, working on something as a group are more beneficial, but kind of those repetitive, tedious jobs are less beneficial, or associated often with negative developmental outcomes. And you see this not just for adolescents, but for adults as well. And I teach that in my adult psychology class. And so, but kind of the issue here is that most of the jobs that adolescents work are, again, retail, customer service oriented jobs which don't really give you a lot of meaningful responsibility. You aren't making important decisions, and you are highly stressed, and you're really not developing like that many skills. So it could be kind of a product of the job itself, wherein we put adolescence as much as just the fact of working. So you got to kind of keep in mind the specific jobs that adolescents are more likely to work in when considering what the developmental impacts of working on responsibilities is. Impact on schooling. The largest risk factor is how many hours an adolescent works, not whether necessarily that the adolescent has a job. Students who work long hours are more likely to be absent from school. They're less likely to participate in extracurriculars, report enjoying school less, spend less time on homework, and earn slightly lower grades. Less ambitious plans for further education. And on average, these long or heavily worked adolescents are less likely to, or are more likely to complete fewer years in college. Teenagers who were less interested in school select longer hour jobs, and working longer hours is associated with less school engagement. It's far less of a risk factor if employment takes place over the summer. Working fewer than 20 hours per week does not appear to have adverse effects, or at least have less adverse effects. So kind of an idea here is that the amount of time that you work also matters. And this is kind of straightforward. You're working 40 hours a week, you have less time to study, less time to engage with your peers, less time to participate in extracurricular activities, but also can shift the way that you're thinking about the world. You're much more focused on the immediate now, and less focus about like your future college career. And some of that is required because, like, imagine a teenager from like a very adverse background, poor background, lower class. They're kind of stuck, they're constrained, so they have to work that way, have to work longer hours, and thus also it's there you have to work more kind of a survival mechanism kind of way versus kind of aiming for long-term or thinking in kind of long-term ways. So on one hand, like working more hours is like a lot, like full-time 30 hours, 40 hours is a risk factor itself, but also, and you see this across development, the adolescents who are most likely to kind of go that route, work those full-time hours, are adolescents who are already at risk, probably more likely to be struggling at school and or have kind of income issues at home. Thus, that's why that kind of summer effect, the impact of working a lot of hours is less because you have less responsibilities in education. So basically, time and energy is finite. You can't be everywhere and do everything. You have to choose. And those choices have benefits in some regards, and every choice has pluses and minuses. In this case, working full-time, make you a little more money, but also put you at a whole risk of negative outcomes. And sometimes people are constrained and they have to make that choice to work more hours. Promotion of problem behavior. Working does not deter teens from delinquent activity by keeping them out of trouble, contrary to popular belief. Working long hours may actually be associated with increases in aggression, school misconduct, precocious sexual activity, and minor delinquency. Studies have found higher rates of smoking, drinking, drug use among workers than non-workers. Risk is higher the more hours you work as an adolescent. Students who are more likely to engage in those activities are more likely to select long-hour jobs, which then exposes them to more risk. Moreover, long-hour workers may also have more relationship problems. Drug use is more likely among adolescents who work in highly stressful jobs than adolescents who work in comparatively amounts of time and money in less stressful environments. All right, so some kind of new information. So we've already talked about before about kind of the lack of monitoring, which can kind of contribute to drug use. And kind of adolescents already at risk, kind of selecting these kind of selecting to work more hours. But not only that, certain jobs are more stressful than others. So if you have a highly stressful job, you're working there and you're working like a lot of hours. So AKA you're getting more an accumulation effect of those stressful work hours. You're gonna be real stressed out. So what do? You gotta self-medicate. You gotta relieve that stress in ways, in some way, and that can be through drug abuse, kind of risky sex, or kind of like maybe aggression, or just risky self-destructive behaviors. Adolescent leisure. Adolescents in the U.S. spend nearly half of their waking hours in leisure activities. Teens report being in a better mood during leisure activities than during school or work. It's difficult, however, to study student moods, or adolescents' moods. Individuals' emotions change throughout the day, and their mood at a particular point may not reflect their mood at other times. So let's jump straight into the specific methods that researchers use to study adolescents' kind of moods, beginning with the experience sampling method. This is a method of collecting data about adolescents' emotional states in which individuals are signaled and asked to report on their mood and activity. It gives a notification from an app before then beepers/pagers. Google it, the youth of America, Google it. Asking who they are talking to, what they are doing, how they're feeling. It can be quite often, every 2 hours, between morning and evening for a week, or longer. So kind of the idea here is that all researchers are going to do is just like spam you with like, oh, what is your mood right now? What are you feeling? What are you doing? And you're just getting hit with that app notification all the time, and you fill it out. In the day, you had the pagers, beepers, Google it, or kind of like having to journal it yourself, like manually, and then give it to researchers later. But obviously this is done, more likely to be done through phones now. Adolescent moods are more positive when with friends and least positive when alone. Granted, this is a 1991 study, but some parts I wouldn't expect it to be super different. Between 5th and 9th grade, adolescent mood around friends become more positive. Between 5th and 7th grade, around family more negative, then increases in middle/high school. They report moderate levels of concentration in school and very low levels of motivation or interest. Higher levels of both concentration and interest in engaging extracurricular activities. That's what students report in these kind of studies. A positive combination of high motivation, concentration, and engagement are most common when involved in sports or in some arts. Unstructured leisure activities is associated with moderate interest, low concentration, like socializing with friends. And structured leisure time is associated with higher developmental outcomes. So we have kind of trends and kind of a developmental trajectory of a daily mood for adolescents, and unsurprisingly, they are kind of less likely to be in a positive mood when they are alone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are mammals, we are social creatures, we need social connections. Being alone, not great. Or being lonely, I should say. Not great, not just being alone. And what researchers focus on and try to measure is, during some activities, is the degree of interest an adolescent has in the activity that they're currently participating in, and how much concentration. So are you just kind of daydreaming through something? Are you highly interested in something, but you're daydreaming? Or are you like very concentrated on something, but you actually really don't care and you just have to do it? So those kind of things like that. And in general, some kind of extracurricular activities such as like arts and sports, broadly stated, there's some differences, kind of have a combination of high motivation, concentration, and engagement. And I really want to talk about the structured and unstructured point. Unstructured leisure activities being associated with moderate interest and low concentration. So socializing with friends. So whatever, you have a moderate interest in what your friend's talking about, but it's also kind of like, I'm kind of daydreaming what's going on. I'm maybe looking at my phone, looking at the TV, kind of, just kind of chilling, basically, with your friends. Now, interestingly, the structured activities, however, are associated with higher developmental outcomes. This kind of makes sense. So maybe in a school setting, you have like a goal or some kind of structure with parental supervision, kind of directing adolescents to do things that are most positively associated, doing activities which are most positively associated, or more likely to be positively associated with positive developmental outcomes, versus kind of like, I'm just chilling at home, watching TV, kind of daydreaming on my phone with my friend who's sitting like next to me, also scrolling on their phone, having a moderate amount of like conversation. Those things aren't like bad necessarily, but kind of like just doing that exclusively and never having unstructured activities can be, or never having structured activities can be a negative, because structured activities do allow adolescents to practice and participate in activities and practice skills that aren't really used as much during that kind of like unstructured playtime. Let's jump into some more information about structured activities. About 85% of U.S. American high school students participate in one or more extracurricular activities. The most popular one is athletics. Other popular activities include music and academic and occupational club occupations, such as science club, language club, and instant careers. Extracurricular participation is more common among adolescents from more affluent families, safer neighborhoods, among white students who earn better grades, and among students from smaller schools and smaller, more rural communities. Yet in rural communities, it's largely just sports. Extracurricular participation is stable over time. Middle class and higher class encourage children to participate in extracurriculars primarily as a means of self-improvement. Working/lower class, more likely to do so to keep children safe / out of trouble after school. Adolescents whose parents are involved in the community and support extracurriculars are more likely to participate. So we have kind of an overall supermajority of adolescents participating in some kind of extracurricular activity, ranging from sports to band to glee club to language clubs, all that jazz. And then, not shockingly, the higher you are in class, the more likely you are to participate in extracurricular activities. Probably because, one, your parents are kind of like college educated, but also you just literally have just like more raw resources. So more extracurricular activities at the school, more safer neighborhoods, so you can kind of go outside and you play and do all that kind of, go roll outside in the grass. So a combination of those raw amount of extracurricular activities available, and also kind of like social support / like kind of like pressure at home. And kind of, thus there are also kind of differences based on kind of like that neighborhood background and the amount of resources you have in your community, your neighborhood, or in your household, with kind of working class U.S. Americans reporting enrolling their children to keep their children like safe, out of trouble after school, because it's like, oh, what is this kid going to do after school? Are they just going to like screw around, like maybe accidentally get in some trouble? Here, let's put them in a kind of a monitored, structured environment wherein now they're kind of away from potentially doing misconduct or hanging out with antisocial peers, and theoretically doing something beneficial, whatever, some kind of club or sports. well, kind of like upper class, kind of suburban, kind of stuff like that. Much more as seeing extracurriculars as self-improvement, but also, again, they very much have in the back of their mind at all times, how do I get my kid to have the best resume? So when they're ready for college, so kind of always kind of thinking that way. But across the board, parents of adolescents who are kind of active in their community and support their child's extracurricular activities makes it more likely that their children will participate in them. So some possible explanations for the positive impact of extracurricular participation. Increase contact with with teachers, I should say, and other school personnel who may increase their understanding of the value of school and sense of belonging. The quality of the bond with adults and activities influences the impact of experience. Often for underachievers, this involvement is what keeps them coming back to school. Increased bonding between students in school makes school more enjoyable. Participation in organized community activities protects at-risk students from exposure to violence. School-sponsored extracurriculars associated with positive outcomes after school could increase belonging to schools. Spillover effects. So some of the positive effects here kind of increase contact with teachers, adults, just theoretically people who are like performing some kind of pro-social good. And that kind of contact, that kind of additional mentorship is very valuable to adolescents. It also, and then as that kind of mentorship and that those social bonds increase or develop or become stronger, I should say, the adolescence is more likely to have a higher sense of belonging, a sense of community that's important, that, oh, this person cares about me, they're taking the time to interact with me, and I do whatever on some hand, again, in the purest sense of the word, I love these teachers, I love these adults, like they care about me, we care about each other, all those kind of things, and that creates that bond. It can serve as kind of a launch point wherein adolescents then value school more, and especially and then also even among underachievers. So it's like, I really don't like school, this is so challenging. Obviously they probably have other issues going on in their community, their household, their personal life, but having that connection to teachers, that camaraderie, that sense of belonging keeps them coming back. So it's kind of like, oh, and that's good, because it's like, hey, let's at least keep this kid in the system, because even if they're not doing optimal in school, it's better than nothing. It's keeping them away from theoretically being at risk for committing more antisocial behaviors, or being surrounded by other antisocial peers. And you see this also among students with a lot of adversity, such as exposure to violence. Again, it protects them, it buffers the impact of exposure to violence. Again, that sense of community, really just positive social relationships, and that sense of belonging is very important. Even in quote-unquote individualistic countries, you can't. Again, we are human, we are mammals. That community will always is always positive. Negative outcomes from certain sports, or I should say, always positive, depending on, you can have like negative communities, but like positive communities is associated with positive outcomes. Anyway, negative outcomes from certain sports: involvement in problem behaviors, fighting delinquency, more antisocial behavior, sports associated with higher risk of alcohol abuse, and higher risk for jock identity. Injuries, increased anxiety and tension due to highly competitive atmosphere, can increase stress. So there are some, however, negative outcomes associated with sports, especially for quote-unquote like jock identities, where maybe you're more likely to be popular, then thus more likely to attend parties and drink, and engage in delinquent behaviors. Maybe make sports in that immediate community more important than your schoolwork. And at the same time, injuries, like literal brain damage from football, to the extent that high school sports exist, or whatever it exists, football exists. But we do know that those kind of concussions do contribute to negative long-term development outcomes. Also, kind of the competitive nature of it, like a lot of pressure. There are a lot of places where cities put a ton of pressure on these like 16, 17-year-old kids. The whole fate of the cities in their hands, and that pressure, that stress, that competitive nature of the sports can contribute to negative developmental outcomes, and contribute to kind of like needing to relieve that stress through maybe drug abuse, for example, or just kind of risky behaviors, or negative risky behaviors. So some studies have found that unstructured, unsupervised times with peers is a risk factor for depression, delinquency, drug and alcohol use, violence, and precocious sexual activities. Also, again, you have to keep in mind that people who are adolescents or are participating in these unstructured, unsupervised times probably also have other kind of like background issues that are creating, increasing the likelihood that they're going to already have depression or other like mental health disorders or something along those lines, and thus are already more likely to engage in delinquency. So basically, you're already putting these at-risk adolescents. There's already an at-risk adolescent, and then you put them with other at-risk adolescents in an unsupervised, unstructured way, and then boom, you're at a greater risk of antisocial behavior. Kind of consistent with what we see across other studies and other constructs. Adolescents who spend 5 or more evenings out in an average week are at least 4 times more likely to be involved in antisocial activity than those who go out less than twice a week. Over the past 2 decades, the number of evenings adolescents spend out each week has dropped. So keep that in mind. We have 2 trends. We talked about that study from 1991, where in being alone, that loneliness being associated with kind of negative developmental outcomes. We saw kind of a decrease in driver's license during that period, the decrease in romantic dating, and then we have now we do know that, again, spending a lot of time unsupervised out is a risk factor, but also what we're seeing is that the amount of time that adolescents are going out, period, has declined. So it's like, have we kind of like, is this like an overcompensation? And maybe not just by a person, but like as a society. Now are we on the other end, wherein these kids aren't going out at all, and thus like, ooh, are they not like developing proper social skills and being exposed to enough things as they develop? Is the question. Time after school. Psychologists debate whether unsupervised children benefit from being on their own. 75% of mothers with children between 6 and 17 years of age work. Fathers, 90%. Affluent suburban white children are more likely to be left home unsupervised than poor minority urban rural children. So kind of this is like a historical fact. Again, we have both parents working. So it's like, okay, well, that's just a fact of life kind of thing now. So like, what are the potential repercussions of this? And that is a debate. Now, interestingly though, in minority and even rural children, white rural children, are less likely to be left alone than like suburban upper class white children, or just suburban affluent children, period. So kind of like maybe kind of even though there's a little more kind of a collective in those racial minority and even poor lower class, there's more of kind of a little collective attitude, and you see this in studies. Not everyone has like all the same rates of individualism and all that kind of stuff. There are differences of class and racial groups within the United States. And in this case, kind of those differences and kind of collective community or extended family can contribute to kind of less unsupervised time in those lower class racial minorities and rural and urban children. Studies suggest that self-cared children, that is children who are spending this time alone, and their peers do not differ in school achievement. Self-cared children, however, may be more socially isolated, more depressed, more likely to have problems at school, be sexually active at younger ages, engage in other problem behaviors, and use more drugs and alcohol. It's important to keep in mind that there are significant differences within self-care populations. Adolescents who go straight home are less likely to engage in problem behavior than those who go to friends' houses or just hang out. So kind of the idea here is there are, although maybe not a lot of differences in school achievement in all studies, however, again, you're alone, you're socially isolated, and you don't have that kind of collective maybe that like even lower class people have, racial minorities have, and urban and rural children may be more likely to have. So thus that kid's alone in the suburbs and not a lot of activities to do, and that can maybe contribute to like depression and just boredom. So it's like, oh, whatever, I'll drink my mom's vodka and try and mix water back into it, and maybe she won't catch it. And there are other differences as well. So it depends on what you do after school when you're alone. Are you just hanging out outside, and not just like at the park and like playing basketball, but like whatever, getting problematic behaviors, hanging out with other peers who have nothing to do, wherein you're more likely to engage in negative risk taking, or are you going home and whatever, just hanging out at your house, chilling. Those kind of differences can impact developmental outcomes. A combination of lack of supervision, having friends who like to party and use drugs, and being susceptible to peer pressure is one proposed reason why unsupervised time is associated with alcohol or drug use. The effects of low parental monitoring is the greatest risk factor when community members are less likely to provide supervision. General recommendations are to provide clear instructions about child's after-school activities, ask child to check in when they get home, and teach child how to handle emergencies. So kind of idea, again, less supervision, having friends who are into kind of drug use increases the likelihood that during your unsupervised time, the adolescent is more likely to engage in kind of negative activities. And these effects are higher in communities wherein like other adults in the community aren't like helping out, wherein like, you know, if you have some adults in the community that are like monitoring all the children, that can be beneficial to the child because they're like, you have multiple basically adult figures helping to, you know, it takes a tribe to raise a kid, that kind of thing. But again, ultimately, it is a collective of coming together to try and raise children. And kind of the general recommendations, again, whatever, you can have your own views about what should be done or what should not be done. And hey, hell, maybe those will happen in the future. But right now, it's like, okay, how do we do with what we have right now? And kind of the general recommendation is, again, it's kind of making sure that your child understands like what their responsibilities, their duties, what they're allowed to do and not do, and then have some kind of communication with the child, like checking in with them, kind of like basic stuff. But one thing that is obvious, is definitely concerning, is that teenagers reporting that they're using pornography as a main source of sex education. So kind of like a lack of sex education at all. And thus, it's like, well, I got to be educated, obviously. So I'm going to educate myself through media that has just sex in it, and use that as kind of my education, which can be obviously problematic. That is not a like NPR scholarly kind of like approach to sex education, but kind of in the absence of that kind of structure, the adolescents are going to try and educate themselves, and you know, this is the using pornography is the most common reported non like school-based sex education. And thus, maybe this places adolescents at kind of risk of making risky sexual decisions, basically based on kind of a lack of information and understanding. And continuing on, one study found that exposure to sexually explicit websites increased the likelihood of sexual activity among adolescents who had just entered puberty, but decreased it among those who were sexually mature. So you can even see differences and potential impacts on being exposed to sexually explicit websites, porn or whatever, depending on the age of the adolescents, with younger adolescents being at greater risk, but older adolescents or more mature sexual adolescents who are also older age being less at risk. So again, it could be depending on developmental timing as well. Adolescent girls who frequently read fashion magazines are more dissatisfied with their bodies than girls who do not, more likely to try to appear sexy in the way that fashion magazines present women in them. Frequently reading magazine articles about dieting/weight loss is associated with increase in unhealthy weight control behaviors. About a quarter of TV advertisements at the same time are related to food. So basically you have kind of this two message kind of situation where on the one hand, we're just bombarded like, woo, eat the new chicken sandwich from Wingstop has one right now. Well, they have like 10 or something. And like, woo, eat that fast food, which, spoiler, not healthy for you. Good at times, but not good for you. But at the same time, we also have like these messages of like dieting, weight loss control, kind of like the classic US skinny kind of like appeal. And then boys are more likely to report dissatisfaction with their body after seeing media with buff models or comparing themselves to others on social media. Excessive time online is associated with girls' body image concerns, compare body to their peers. So it's not really just like magazines and media and stuff like that. A lot of this is also kind of rooted in comparing it to peers. So girls kind of, Instagram is one obviously common example of this, going on there and comparing adolescents, comparing their body to others, and you know that's literally the medium. It's just photos of you, and then kind of that constant barragement of photos of your peers, and then kind of that comparison, and then also being again chronically online, so lonely, bored, absence of like more on like social connections, and then at the same time being online and just massively comparing yourself, just literally an endless infinite feed of photos that you can compare yourself, can be quite negative. And you can also see this with boys as well. Moving on to violence. More than 60% of TV programming in the U.S. contains violence. Young Americans see approximately 10,000 violent acts per year. Adolescents spend a lot of time playing video games, getting into more fights and arguments than do their peers who don't play video games or only play video games a little bit of time. But the actual effects of playing are often non-significant. It's difficult to determine if video games are causing the behavior or if adolescents more prone to the behavior play those types of games more, combined with a less social interaction outside of gaming contributing to the greatest risk. When controlling for prior aggression, video game effects on direct aggression are small/not significant. Some studies indicate playing violent video games does not change behaviors, but increases acceptability of aggressive behavior. Carefully controlled studies have found that playing video games, or violent video games, does not make adolescents more aggressive. If it did, we would expect to see violent adolescent crime skyrocketing. But the increase in violent video games is negatively correlated with adolescent violent crime. Some studies have found excessive gaming associated with depression, not aggression. So like what we said with TV, like selecting aggression, it's kind of difficult to say, oh, are already the adolescents who are most prone to violence the ones who play more violent video games? So kind of separating that between like, oh, is violent video games, quote unquote, causing violence? But we do know that playing video games just in general, just being excessive amount of video games, and at the same time, basically having little social interactions, again in person, which that boredom, depression, loneliness contributes to the greatest risk across the board, not just violence and aggression. And the violence doesn't have to be or personal or whatever, like punching a hole through a wall or something like that. It doesn't have to be hitting a person, but also like depression, like that is most likely. And again, a lot of video games, while at the same time, very, very little social interaction. However, some studies have found that maybe violent video games impact the acceptance of aggression towards others. So maybe I play a lot of video games, and then I'm like, all right, yeah, it is more. I'm more likely to say that it's appropriate to engage maybe in violence, even if I'm not particularly doing it, but maybe I accept it more in my community, in my country, or whatever. Maybe I'm more likely to support some kind of war or something along those lines. But it should be noted that the rates of adolescent violent crimes are much, 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 much lower than they were 50, 60, 70 years ago. So basically there's a negative correlation. Doesn't make any wherein the presence of online video games have increased during the last, I'll just make up a number, 60 years. At the same time, the amount of violence of adolescents have decreased. So thus, it's not a one-to-one correlation. There's a whole host of other things that could possibly be going on here on why the U.S. is much more, usually this is revolve around like the gun deaths and stuff like that. So much more like complicated than like the presence of video games and stuff like that. And in fact, again, excessive gaming, which is a lot of gamers, associated with like depression. Kind of straightforward. You have less human connections, kind of less community, less interaction with people. Guess what? You're gaming, ultimately, you're sitting alone on a screen, and kind of Twitch tries to kind of get around with that. You're basically bringing a bunch of like lonely people together to try to form kind of an adaptive community, which I mean makes sense. It's an adaptive mechanism. Motivation also matters. Adolescents gaming for fun is not associated with negative outcomes. Gaming for escaping is a larger risk factor. Pro-social games is more likely to increase empathy and pro-social behaviors. Playing a sport game is associated with participation in sports. It may be that highly competitive, rather than just violence itself, games that are most associated with negative developmental outcomes. Numerous studies have shown that repeated exposure to violent imagery on television contributes to aggressive behavior in children and youth. Violent TV watching during childhood is associated with increased tolerance for violence and greater desensitization of the effects of violence on others. Risk factor far higher in adolescents with previous history of aggression. Some of the effects due to people with aggressive tendencies watching these programs, relational aggression may be similar. So kind of our motivation also of why we're playing video games matters. Are we playing this just to have some fun, to chill, I'm not that good, like it ain't that real though, stakes aren't that real, versus like, dude, I have my entire like life wrapped in this game. If I don't do well in this game, I'm about to fucking chuck this video game across the room, punch a hole in my wall, lose my mind. And kind of one reason why the latter kind of motivation is more associated with negative developmental outcomes. It's because those people who are experiencing that are more likely to using gaming as a escape from the world around them. They're stressed out about the world around them. They're, again, lonely, bored, isolated, atomized from society, and it's like, dude, I have no other thing I can do. Let me game, and thus this is my primary activity, and it sucks. It sucks losing, and that's like frustrating and stressful, and that feels bad. And thus, like, you're at a greater risk because like the one thing you're putting all your energy to, you're just basically getting negative feedback, and that's tough. That's tough on, you know, for anyone, not just adolescents, but for adults as well. And I already made that kind of acceptance and then maybe a possible acceptance or kind of desensitization with a lot of exposure to violent TV or something along those lines. However, interestingly, and consistent with other developmental outcomes, adolescents who have already had a previous experiences with violence are at greater risk of developing a desensitization or kind of acceptance of violence around you when they see it on TV. So, or like violent video games. So maybe it's like, oh, I experienced this firsthand. I know that this world is violent. Now I'm seeing it on TV. That matches up with my, you know, lived experience and all that stuff. Therefore, I'm just going to accept violence. There's nothing you can do. So kind of an impact of your environment combining with like TV, what you see around you. And maybe something similar, maybe related to relational aggression. So like I've experienced with like bullying, gossiping, kind of classic meat grump stuff. And then I see it on TV and I'm like, oh, okay, so this is my real world. This is the TV world. I guess that's consistent. Boom. Okay, so maybe I'll just accept relational aggression as a fact of life. Moving on to drugs, alcohol, tobacco, or illicit drugs are present in nearly 3/4 of primetime network dramatic programs in the U.S., nearly all popular movies, and half of all music videos. About 10% of commercials that young people see on TV are for beer and wine. Some studies have found if their favorite character in a film smokes, they are more likely to smoke. As for alcohol and tobacco, as well as anti-smoking commercial messages have been shown to change teenagers' attitudes about drinking and smoking. The impacts of evaluation of the social approval of drug use, or I should say it impacts the evaluation of the social approval of drug use. Pointing out the motives of drug companies seems to be effective. Repeatedly overhyping use can make adolescent substance use far more common than it is. It is hard to know whether changing adolescents' exposures to messages about drinking or smoking actually changes their behaviors. Can't systematically expose some teens to ads. So I want to talk about a couple of these bullet points, such as pointing out the motives of drug companies seems to be more effective. So kind of a lot of the, one interesting aspect is like talking, when discussing kind of drug use, alcohol use, pointing out kind of the motivations of drug companies, or not just drug companies, but, well, they are drug companies, but like alcohol companies in their advertisements seems to be effective. So kind of like saying, hey, listen, why they're saying this and presenting you this information is because they want to make a profit. So kind of like looking at it, kind of like an kind of classic, you know, like anti-establishment kind of thing, being like, oh, that corporation's motive is because they want to make a lot of profit and they're kind of using you. So kind of like challenging or I should say, kind of presenting the incentive structure of those companies seems to be at least semi-effective at minimizing the impact of kind of drug commercials or whatever, alcohol commercials on adolescents' drug use, to the extent that that association exists, or at least kind of making it seem like less cool. It's like, yeah, they're presenting it as something that that is super cool because, hey, they just want to make money off you. So it might be useful. And also making sure that you don't like overdo things, being like, oh, every single adolescent is smoking, it's drinking, you know, they're all just high and they're just wilding out. Because what you're basically telling the adolescent is, hey, that drug use is normative. It's something everyone's doing, so therefore they're basically telling you, hey, if you want to be like cool and socially accepted among your peers, do drug use. So aka, don't overhype things, because you're basically indirectly saying everybody's doing this activity. Just be cool. Be cool. Hey, drug use exists, like, but you aren't being bombarded with like alcohol when you're switching classes in high school. Not kind of a thing. It ain't that cool. It ain't that real at 15 years old. Socializing through social media, increased availability of electronic devices has affected the ways that adolescents socialize. The impact of social media on adolescents' behavior and development is challenging to measure and controversial. Social communication online creates both positive and negative experiences, harmful consequences, and positive effects. Facebook depression, thought to result from spending too much time obsessing checking on online relationships. So kind of again, the more there could be some positive and negative impacts, but again, these kind of chronic online, which again, on average, we're seeing cohort effects where people are more and more online, and not just cohorts, frankly, everybody getting more and more online. You see this with older adults, as teaches in my adult psychology class, everybody getting more online. So it's like, okay, yes, there are positive effects, but are we all really just spending 1 or 2, 3 hours online, or is it more? And you can see it was Facebook depression. So just being super on Facebook, obviously slightly a different era where Facebook was a little more popular for college students, but kind of same idea with other social media things. But on Facebook, kind of spending all online, constantly checking your online relationships, just being like chronically like insecure basically and anxious about your relationship, and just constantly refreshing or whatever, being on checking out your friends on Facebook, as it can be associated with depression. Most adolescents, however, use the internet to communicate with people they see in person. This can also help facilitate self-disclosure, which is an important part of like building social bonds. Online communication may be especially important for socially anxious adolescents. However, the most risk is when the use isolates the adolescents and increases stress. So yes, it can facilitate self-disclosure, especially on people you've already met, like in school and like in your high school or whatever. Kind of like having that, continuing to engage in conversation outside school can be beneficial socially. And for like anxious teens who are a little more anxious about communicating, using online to communicate can also be useful. However, the most risk is, again, when you are chronically online and when you are isolated and lonely, and using the internet stresses you out. So again, the question then is like, okay, yeah, so the greatest risk is for people who are isolated, but like, what happens if the entire country is isolated? What happens if everybody across the world is more isolated and more stressed when they're online? So then it's okay. So then it's like, if we do have like an increased isolated, lonely, bored, atomized population who is all chronically online and super stressed out, is that just what online is now? And thus, is it really useful to make this distinction between the 1 to 3 hours of online time versus always online and also being isolated if the entire population is reporting, we see studies of this, of loneliness increasing? That is a question. Use of social media has mixed effects in the context of romantic relationships. So it's easier to flirt online than in person sometimes. However, the understanding of emotional context is harder. So whatever, just like sending that text and then woo, throw it on my phone, woo, we did it. Versus, can you really have even not just like sexual intimacy, but just intimacy on like a human connection level? Is that through the phone the same as in person? Can you read that context? Is it as meaningful? Is it different? Maybe, maybe not. That argument is debated, and this is something that everybody's working through. This is new shit. Like this technology just got invented, like, you know, some of these social media sites have been invented in the last 10 years. Others, but everything is really within the last 20 years. We are the guinea pigs of this. And so thus we don't know, but we're working through it and we're finding out in real time. I want to skip down to the last 2 bullet points. Frequent messaging, especially when acquaintances who are not close friends, can become compulsive, associated with anxiety, depression, especially in adolescents who use social media to combat boredom. So as stated before, yes, it can be useful, the internet, for socially anxious people, but at the same time, okay, is some of that social anxiety the fact that we're all kind of alone, isolated, and thus having like less social experience and having a chance to develop those social skills in meaningful contexts when we have like genuine human connections? So in the absence of that, are we all kind of seeing an increase of anxiety-like symptoms? and then going online, which is beneficial on one hand, but then we're online all the time. And now, as stated here, we are compulsively online, chronically online, and now we've actually increased our anxiety. Again, kind of rooted in that overall kind of like boredom and loneliness and isolation. Social media sites are a context in which the socially rich get richer and the socially poor get poorer. Lonely social media users are more likely to use media to engage in social comparison and feedback seeking, which may increase anxieties. So again, and these are questions like large trends we've talked about in this class all the time, that these macro trends impact kind of norms and averages of behaviors. Are we at a time right now where like everybody's seeing a little more anxiety, we're more lonely, and we're all more online? So it's like you can separate that theoretical impact of the internet versus like where are we right now and what is happening. And then I think you have to consider that context when, again, trying to think this through literally in real time. Some problematic social media reasons include internet addiction, a disorder in which an individual use of the internet is pathological. It's defined by 6 symptoms: salience, mood change, tolerance, withdrawal, conflict, and relapse and reinstatement. Salience, that is describing being online is the most important thing in your life. So it's like everything is online, and not just like everything online, but like all your social connections are online. Most of your social activity is online. Mood change. One's mood fluctuates as a function of internet experiences. Tolerance, needing more and more internet time to feel satisfied. So the more, like a drug, the more time you spend online, the more, and you know, this is problematic uses, kind of the more online activity you need to feel satisfied. In this, you're online more and more chronically, you're more socially isolated, and now all of a sudden, you can't reach that same satisfaction that you had when you were like 10, 12 years old. You can't go back. You're now an adolescent, or you're an adult, and you're trying to recreate that satisfaction again, but you can't get it. It's gone. Withdrawal, experiencing negative feelings when prevented from being online. Conflict. Internet has caused problems in relationships or some other aspects of your life. Relapse and reinstatement, returning to addictive internet behavior after getting it under control. And just to touch base on that final one a little bit, as I said before, with kind of, I stated before, where it's like, okay, phone use compared to what? Like, what are the alternatives that exist in society that allow people who are like, yo, dude, this internet is like screwing with my brain. Like, I'm on my algorithm, I'm reinforcing like the worst parts of me, socially isolated. Okay, I'm gonna get off. And then it's like, okay, well, I'm offline, I'm just sitting in my house alone, bored, staring at a wall. So it's like, okay, well, what do we do as a society to kind of redirect that? And that frankly does not exist. So then it's all of a sudden you're back online, and maybe you're even more, you've relapsed, quote unquote relapse, thinking as like a drug, and then boom, you're back online, and you become even more, that salience, that need to be online becomes stronger. Excessive social media use is associated with mental health problems, depression, loneliness, social anxiety, and sleep problems. Are teens who are prone to those developmental outcomes more likely